Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. You're listening to another edition of Planets in Profile. Today, we're going to take a look at Venus in Scorpio. So, the last edition of this series, we looked at Venus in the sign of Libra, and we're going in order as Venus changes signs right now in 2018. And then later on down the road, we'll switch over and start looking at other planets as well. So, this is a really important sign for Venus because it's one of two signs where Venus is said to be in her detriment. Now, the word detriment sounds pretty harsh, so we need to do a little correcting of some misperceptions that come around with the language of essential dignities. The language of essential dignities is very, very old. It's thousands of years old in astrology, and it refers very basically to the way that planets behave when they are placed in the home temples of other planets, which are the signs. So when Venus is placed in the signs that are opposite to her own home places, which are Taurus and Libra, she lands in Scorpio or Aries, both of which are Mars-ruled signs, and hence Venus acts a little bit more Mars-like or has to contend with the energies or symbolism of Mars, even though her own nature is opposite or contrary to Mars. So for ancient astrologers, the language of essential dignities was used in order to understand the different kinds of sympathies and antipathies that planets had with one another. So what is Venus? Venus likes harmony. Venus likes beauty. Venus likes agreement. Venus likes compromise and diplomacy and peace. Venus is aesthetic and pleasing. Venus is tasteful and desirous. Venus is attractive. Mars, on the other hand, Venus's planetary opposite, is aggression, cutting, dividing, severing, competition, hostility, challenge. It is about courage, facing fear. It's about guardianship. Well, Mars has themes that are both contrary to Venus, but also across the spectrum that might be more virtuous or more sort of dubious. So Venus is the same way. Venus can represent agreement, relationship, accord, beauty, but also lust, vanity, superficiality, PC, politeness, this kind of stuff. So it's not that one planet is good and one planet is bad, but for ancient astrologers, Venus was called the lesser benefic and Mars was called the lesser malefic. The basic reason for this is that the natures of the planets were thought to be connected to conditions that were either conducive to life and growth or harming of life and growth. Mars was thought to be excessively hot and dry, which is not good for plant life. Venus is warm and moist, which is good for plant life. So generally speaking, the contraries or opposite natures of these planets means that when you put one of them into the sign of the opposite, that they struggle. This is what's meant by Venus and Scorpio being in her detriment. But the Greek translation of the same word was often called exile. And the basic meaning of a planetary exile is that it's as though you are trying to get along and be yourself and do your thing in an environment that's contrary to the one that you typically like to be in. For example, Venus in Libra might be like a very sophisticated opera that you go to enjoy a nice theater performance or something like that. Mars in Scorpio, Mars in Aries, maybe a little bit more like an MMA fight, a cage match, right? Now, there may be elements of competitiveness and aggression in things like figure skating or opera that, more quote unquote Venetian things. And there may be elements of beauty in MMA or cage fighting, right? So they're always intertwined with one another. They're never separate. The planets do not exist in a vacuum. They are part of what they do is they represent the realm of dualities that we live in, which are things like beauty and ugliness, things like aggression and peace. Those dualities are expressed always in relationship between the planets. So that's what Venus and Mars represent. So we're not saying that Venus is bad in this sign or Venus is good in that sign in some really kind of blockheaded way. What we're trying to do is get across the subtleties of how a planet behaves or acts when it's hanging out in the home of another planet. Just like I'm an astrologer. If you put me in the house of a diehard empirical scientist who thinks astrology is bunk, I'm going to be really uncomfortable. I'm going to have a hard time being myself and kind of doing my thing. Similar, if you put that scientist probably into my, my tripped out astrology layer, they would struggle too. So that's the idea. So Venus in Scorpio, Scorpio is a solid feminine water sign. It's the sign of the scorpion, and it's the domicile or feminine home of Mars. So first of all, Venus in this autumnal sign, it's called a solid sign, which means that the values or virtues of the sign, almost on a subtle energetic level, have to do with stability, consistency, repeatability. So that's why we call it a solid sign. On the other hand, if you look at Scorpio from the perspective of the elements, it's a water sign, which means it values things like emotionality, feeling-based or instinctual-based experiences. If you look at the fact that it's feminine, it means that it's more yin-like, passive, receptive, responsive, but not reactive. So when you put Venus into those elements, those are feminine. Some of this feminine stuff, Venus has no problem with that. But what it does have a hard time with is the Mars-like dynamic. So Mars and Scorpio, you can think of Mars and Scorpio, the feminine home of Mars, like it's instinctual and it's feminine, but it's also very protective and potentially very aggressive. So think, for example, I live in Washington, D.C. I can't even count how many clients in the area who work in defense, cybersecurity, etc. Very strong Scorpio signatures in their chart, because Scorpio is often interested in security, a solid sign that wants stability, and it's feminine, so it wants to protect a kind of homeostasis. It wants to keep something together, and it's not as interested in enacting dynamic change like masculine yang signs are. And a water sign, very sensitive, very senses, has a deep sense of where threats are. It can be very strong in protecting or guarding things. Think of Venus or Mars in Scorpio, or any Mars more yang like planet like Uranus in Scorpio or something like that. You also think about the kind of the yang energy blending with the feminine qualities of Scorpio is kind of like a watchdog sitting on your porch. It's sound asleep. It looks peaceful. It's an animal. It's a natural kind of feminine image. But this watchdog, if it senses anyone coming down the street, will alert and like look and what is it, and do I sense anything, and they'll start huffing and whatever. So the slightest elements of potential danger, there's a kind of guardian protective motif that rises up. Is in some ways Venus in Scorpio is about trying to maintain a deep level of peace and security. But the thing is that the amount of attentiveness and the kind of eye for danger, or the eye for possible betrayals or upset or drama or upheaval, it creates a kind of anxiety that it can produce in Venus that's not always easy to deal with. So you do have to remember that if you have Venus in your birth chart and you struggle with that, just know that that's a natural part of the challenge of having Venus in Scorpio. However, Venus trying to create peace, trying to create compromise, trying to create beauty in a Mars-like sign such as Scorpio, you will see her sometimes struggle with things like passive aggression, jealousy, insecurity, betrayal, lust, kind of drama, and creating unnecessary dramas in relationships. Why? Because Venus is trying to figure out how to do her natural harmonizing thing, again, in a sign that has Mars as its ruler, which is more conflict-oriented, confrontation-oriented, dynamic in nature. So those are some of the basic reasons why you may see some degree of struggle or challenge while Venus is in Scorpio. You can also talk about planets in two basic ways. Planets can be topical signifiers, or they can be natural signifiers. For example, in a tarot spread, you may have the card of, let's say you're doing a family constellation with tarot cards. One of the tarot cards may represent your mother, and there may be the Eight of Wands in that position. The position that's being held could be occupied by any card, right? But it just so happens that the Eight of Wands is occupying the card that represents your mother. Okay. Similarly, in astrology, a topical significator would be if Venus ruled your second house of finances, or your seventh house of relationships, or your 10th house of career, or your 11th house of friends or social circles, or what have you, your ninth house of long journeys or religion or higher education. Venus may be the stand-in actor representing those topics, just like a tarot card could land in the position of the mother, or could land in the past or present or future position in a spread. So Venus may represent topics by virtue of what houses she rules. But Venus may also always enact her own natural significations: love, harmony, beauty, grace, and the two can combine in different ways. So Venus as a topical significator, if Venus is in Scorpio and Venus rules different topics in your birth chart, that might mean that those topics experience different kinds of setbacks or challenges relative to the kinds of challenges that Venus in Scorpio has, which we've just been discussing. So for example, if Venus in Scorpio rules your finances on a very basic level, you could say there might be some challenges with finances. And then the trick is figuring out how to discern what do Venetian financial troubles look like. For example, Venus in Scorpio, financial troubles could have something to do with hoarding one's money, or being very secretive or possessive about one's money, because there may be a hard time just laying back and enjoying things without a sense of protectiveness or kind of Mars-like intensity. Or one could be very impulsive and wasteful and spend a lot of money on things that aren't healthy, because there's a lusty kind of desirous Mars-like quality that Venus is contending with. And yet that person may end up keeping their financial, their shadier financial habits a secret. They may not want to show them. They're a little bit of ashamed about it socially. That's Venus and Scorpio kind of stuff around money. But Venus and Scorpio could rule any other topic and possibly bring different kinds of challenges into those areas of life. On the other hand, Venus is a natural significator: love, relationships, beauty, aesthetic, taste, style, even to a certain extent how you present yourself or get along with others socially. That's sort of Venus in your chart on a psychological level. Natural significations, you may enjoy Mars-like men or women, even though you're sort of conflicted about them, right? So you may be attracted to trouble, the bad boy, the bad girl. On the other hand, that's very stereotypical. You could also be attracted to people who have some kind of darker or more erotic qualities to them, because it's Venus, but in the kind of dark autumnal Mars-like sign of Scorpio. So you're attracted to something that's darker, more subterranean, a little bit more underworld. You might also attract in relationships different kinds of subtle Mars issues: passive aggression, jealousy, betrayal, manipulation, intensity, drama, and you can feel kind of conflicted about it. So those are some of the things natural signification wise that you might attract or be attracted to, or things that could show up in your relationships. So Venus, remember, can represent topics in your chart by virtue of what houses she rules: the Libra house and the Taurus house. If you're using whole sign houses, that'll be 2 houses in your chart. If you are looking at Venus naturally in your chart, again, love, beauty, relationships, style, appearance, taste, values. So she could also show up and in those areas attract different kinds of challenges with Mars-like stuff, or maybe some synthesis with Mars-like stuff. For example, let's give a few positive examples of Venus in Mars's sign of Scorpio to close with. Venus and Mars's sign of Scorpio is a little bit like the imagination of Tim Burton, who did The Nightmare Before Christmas. There is a sense of sweetness and dark, artful, conflicted, even horrific qualities. Think of Edward Scissorhands, kind of Venus and Scorpio. Um, on the other, and so this artistic marriage of dark and light kind of themes, because Venus never wants to admit that she actually loves Mars, and Mars kind of never wants to admit that he loves Venus. And there's an irony in their relationship. In Greek myth, of course, Venus and Mars were adulterous lovers, that sort of forbidden, taboo lovers, because are peace and love really supposed to love each other? You know what I mean? Aren't they supposed to hate each other? Isn't peace opposed to love, or isn't peace opposed to war, and war opposed to peace, and never the two shall meet? But no, there's there's a creative tension when Venus is in Scorpio that represents the strong warrior woman, or also the idea of the sexual, the kind of sexual independence, the fight for different kinds of sexual freedoms. So there's synthesis available as well, but don't think that it's all. One of the things that I think we do in modern astrology, in the rush to try and make everything very nice and pleasing, which is not what astrology's real job is, because we're here to grow and learn, and learning and growing often means we have to grow through pain and suffering, and we have to learn how to meet that. That's what most great mystics like the Buddha tell us. But so we can't just dismiss the idea that Venus and Scorpio provides us with some difficulties by virtue of being in Mars's sign. And that's the main point I wanted to get across today, because of course there's always synthesis available, but we grow the most when we try to work into the tensions and challenges. That's where we end up finding synthesis that's unique to us, that's unique to our situation. So, all right, that's what I've got for you guys today. Hope you're having a good one, and take care. We'll be back in a while, not for a while, until Venus is going from Scorpio back into Sagittarius. So that's going to be not until basically toward the end of the year, I believe. So, at any rate, have a good one. We'll talk to you soon.